Criston Cole's relationship with Rhaenyra Targaryen undoubtedly had a huge influence on his character at the start of House of the Dragon, and the dissolution of that relationship undeniably had a significant and permanent effect on the trajectory of the rest of his life. However, while those events had a huge impact on the person that he ultimately became, his connection to and feelings about Rhaenyra certainly don't define him as a person, which is why the broader audience perception of him is so confusing. In a sense, it's at least partially understandable that many viewers see Criston Cole through the lens of his link to Rhaenyra. House of the Dragon may be a pretty large ensemble, but Rhaenyra has been presented as the protagonist literally since the introductory title card of the series. And beyond that, Sir Criston is only incorporated into the story as a direct result of Rhaenyra's decision to recruit him into the Kingsguard. So, Sir Criston wouldn't even have a role in this saga without Rhaenyra's intervention, and since she is the central player of the tale, relating Criston Cole to Rhaenyra is a reasonable impulse. But on the flip side, like every other character in the story, Sir Criston has motivations, feelings, and relationships that exist completely outside of Rhaenyra Targaryen. Yes, his decisions are sometimes influenced by his likely somewhat traumatic experiences with her. But the perception of him as nothing more than her jilted lover who has devoted an entire lifetime to undermining her as a result of being dumped is a comically one-dimensional misunderstanding of his character overall. Criston's relationship with Rhaenyra was a pivotal turning point for him as a person, but he lived for decades before even meeting her and has continued on decades after their breakup. And to write all of that character development off as irrelevant in the face of Rhaenyra's impact on him is absurd. House of the Dragon doesn't dive too deeply into Sir Criston's origin story, but the tidbits that they do offer are pretty interesting. One of the most telling elements of his characterization in the series is actually extremely noteworthy because of how it differs from his character's background in the books. In Fire and Blood, Sir Criston is the son of a steward from the Stormlands, but in House of the Dragon, it is specifically noted that he comes from the same place, but is of Dornish descent. And while the series doesn't get into it very much, during this era, Dorne was still resisting the rule of House Targaryen and was not yet part of the Seven Kingdoms. Even after Dorne finally agreed to exist under the Iron Throne, Dornish people were pretty culturally distinct from the rest of Westeros. And they were also the subject of a lot of racist discrimination. Meaning that at the time of Sir Criston's rise to the royal court, he was undoubtedly the target of some pretty intense racial bigotry. And that is on top of the prejudice that he undoubtedly would have faced as a man who was nothing more than the son of a steward. This, of course, should paint Rhaenyra's interactions with Sir Criston in a much more intense light as well. While his accomplishments as a fighter are actually astounding when you realize that he was competing against people with the kind of education, wealth, and access that Daemon Targaryen had, and still managed to beat them, it also makes his ability to fully consent to a relationship with Rhaenyra far more questionable. Criston's consent has obviously been a topic of discussion among fans of House of the Dragon. But consent in Westeros is a complex issue in general that is hard to navigate because the social structure is so strict and stratified that it's hard to gauge whether or not anyone from different social ranks can truly consent or gain consent from someone else. The show also went out of its way to demonstrate that Criston had some discomfort and resistance. So the question of whether or not he is truly a willing partner to Rhaenyra is something that the series intentionally wanted people to ask. Within the context of Criston Cole's social status and upbringing, I think his ability to say no to Rhaenyra, even if he wanted to, was borderline non-existent. She massively outranks him in terms of social status. He's culturally isolated and rejected from the society that they live in, and Rhaenyra is entirely responsible for the higher social position that he finds himself in by the time their sexual relationship begins. So the reality of the situation seems to be that even if he was romantically interested in her, even if he wanted to sleep with her, he likely wasn't in a position to deny her if he did want to. And to add to the complexity of that issue, there is also the fact that he could literally be killed for being intimate with a princess. So even if he was attracted to Rhaenyra and ultimately wanted to be with her, He is being pursued by someone who has total control over his life, and he is being put in mortal danger via their relationship, while Rhaenyra is not. Therefore, that seems to make his full and complete consent something that cannot really exist in their dynamic, regardless of his personal desire. From this point of view, it is obvious that his romance with Rhaenyra would be a turning point for his character, but it is only so influential on the person that he becomes because of who he was before he even met Rhaenyra. If he were not in such a powerless position, and if the stakes weren't so high for him, then it might not be a life-defining experience. But he is relatively powerless, and the stakes are literally life and death, so it becomes a pivotal moment for him. It's also interesting, because many viewers seem to define his relationship with Alicent through the lens of Rhaenyra as well. And there is certainly an angle where that makes sense, as Alicent and Criston have both been on the losing end of Rhaenyra's choices and actions. But to minimize their connection as little more than the Rhaenyra anti-Stan Club is bizarre and confusing. Interestingly, Alicent and Criston can obviously relate to each other because they were both in positions of relative powerlessness when they were sexually exploited by people far more powerful than they were. I doubt this is ever a point of actual discussion between them, but similarly, Alicent is the daughter of a second son of House Hightower, and she is a teenage girl when she is married to the adult king. And although the framing of the scenes are quite different, House of the Dragon seems to intentionally make this parallel between them in Episode 4. In this installment, the series quite directly juxtaposes the young Alicent being unwillingly called to Viserys' room to please him, while Rhaenyra is out for a night of debauchery with Daemon that leaves her unsatisfied, and ultimately seeking out Sir Criston to give her the satisfaction that she's looking for. And while Criston seems like a more willing participant than Alicent is, the dynamic between the two scenarios is quite similar. A person in a powerful position seeks out someone they have power over in order to get what they want out of them. Ergo, Alicent and Criston both know exactly what it's like to be in that situation, which seems like it would be a far deeper connection between them than whatever animosity they hold for Rhaenyra. Even beyond that, the clearest and deepest connection between Alicent and Criston may have been a result of Rhaenyra's actions, but to assume that Sir Criston cares more about having someone to gossip about Rhaenyra with than he does about the fact that Alicent literally saved his life is absurd. I think a significant contributing factor to why so many people focus on Rhaenyra's role in Sir Criston's life is simply the timeline that House of the Dragon is working with as well. Because we see all of these things happening in rapid succession, it's easy to forget that it has been literal decades since Sir Criston has become ingrained into the lives of Alicent and her children. He has spent nearly 20 years as Alicent's closest friend and confidant, and he has essentially played the role of a surrogate parent to Alicent's children in place of Viserys. And off the bat, some viewers didn't really notice what a vital role that Sir Criston played not just in Alicent's life, but the life of her children, which is understandable because the signs are easy to miss. However, his closeness with Aegon, Aemond, and even Helaena have been clearly demonstrated throughout the series, and it's obvious that he has a relationship with them that goes beyond just caring for them as members of the royal family, or even as Alicent's children. The most overt introduction to Sir Criston's surrogate parental role comes when he is training young Aegon and Aemond against the Strongboys. And although some write this interaction off as little more than Sir Criston doing what will help Alicent and will hurt Rhaenyra, there seems to be a lot of depth built into that scene at the moment and in the long run. Firstly, the positioning on its own is fascinating and pretty clearly puts Sir Criston in the place of the father training his children against the other father, Harwin Strong, training his. He certainly makes a point of needling Harwin until he snaps, which again could be interpreted as jealousy, but could also be interpreted as concern and frustration at the position that the children who he has come to see as his own being endangered by the illegitimacy of Harwin Strong's sons. And it's interesting to see how this moment seems to come full circle when Aegon and Aemond are adults facing off against Jace and Luke. At this point, the rivalry between them is well cemented, And while Aegon and Aemond clearly have the advantage in terms of age and size, their confrontation with the other boys is extremely meaningful and could be very telling regarding how Criston Cole has trained and raised them. In fact, the entire conflict between Aemond and Jace is a pretty direct mirror to the confrontation between Harwin and Criston. Sir Criston pokes at the illegitimacy of the strong boys until Sir Harwin reacts violently, and Aemond alludes to the strong boys' illegitimacy until Jace reacts violently. However, when Sir Harwin and Jace both get violent, Sir Criston and Aemond don't respond in kind at all. They just allow themselves to be hit and literally laugh off the punches. And it's obvious that neither of them are incapable of defending themselves. Despite Sir Harwin's size, Sir Criston's skills are probably good enough to give Harwin a run for his money. And similarly, Aemond could clearly wreck Jace given that he is now as good of a fighter as Sir Criston. However, neither of them hit back, either because the violence was what they were after, or they realized that despite their own strength and skill, the consequences of lashing out at someone who has consistently been prioritized over them will likely result in greater punishment than just being hit. And this scene parallel alone seems to demonstrate that Sir Criston's relationship goes beyond just training the boys to be warriors. Because Aemond and even Aegon don't just fight like him, they act like him. Given their superior battle skill sets, it's obvious that Sir Criston knew that he was preparing them for eventual war, but their attitudes seem to be intentionally directly referential to Criston Cole's behavior in his earlier years, too. But unsurprisingly, the role that Sir Criston plays in the family of the Hightower Targaryens is most clearly demonstrated during the Green Council. Not only does he literally kill someone in defense of Alicent right off the bat, but he has individual moments with every one of the children that shows that he has a connection with them that goes beyond Alicent and goes far beyond politics or personal vendettas against an ex-girlfriend. Even the very fact that Sir Criston is in the personal chambers of Alicent and Aemond after Viserys' death communicates a much deeper bond than most would expect him to have. And the fact that Sir Criston and Alicent are comfortable talking intimately in front of Aemond, as well as the fact that Aemond has no real reaction to it, certainly makes it seem like this is familiar territory. The moments between Aemond and Sir Criston actually might be the most telling of all, as Aemond doesn't seem like a particularly expressive or open person, and yet he tells Sir Criston a story about Aegon taking him to a brothel that to most would be humiliating, and that sounds like it may have been somewhat traumatic for him. Sir Criston's reaction is sincere, and he acts in the way that you would expect many parents to, i.e. he essentially tells Aemond to drink his respect women juice. Later, Aemond expresses jealousy about Aegon, which again is incredibly personal and somewhat risky to share with someone, especially someone in Sir Criston's position. And despite the fact that Aemond was born into a far more privileged position than Sir Criston, Cole relates to him and lets him know that he knows how it feels to work harder for what comes so easily to others. Once they do finally find Aegon, again the brief moments between Sir Criston and the boys seem to be deceptively telling and complex. Aegon appears to be willing to do anything in order to escape being crowned as king, and he and Aemond are attempting to make a deal that will allow Aegon to flee. But Sir Criston interrupts them and tells them that they have to go to Alicent. And fascinatingly, they don't argue or put up a fight. This is yet another incident that is hard to grasp the full depth of unless you're keenly aware of how strict the social structure of Westeros is, and how low on the totem pole Criston Cole really is. Because Aegon and Aemond are now in the highest positions of power in the entire country. They were already born Targaryens, and since Viserys is gone, the power of the Iron Throne theoretically belongs to Aegon. And yet, when a lowborn Dornishman, when a member of the Kingsguard tells the man who is about to become king that he has to go talk to mommy, Aegon just does what he says. Aegon essentially just became Sir Criston's boss, and he's letting Sir Criston order him around like a child. But the real clincher that explains how much of a parental role that Sir Criston must have played in the lives of all of the Green kids actually comes during Rhaenys' attack on the coronation. Alicent goes to defend Aegon and asks Sir Criston to protect Helaena, which he does. Like everyone, Helaena is obviously afraid. And as Sir Criston puts himself between her and Meleys, Helaena grabs his arm. Now, this could have just been a moment of improvised acting, but Helaena has been consistently coded as neurodivergent and has consistently been shown to dislike human touch. Even when her own mother touches her, she will oftentimes cower away or reject Alicent in some way. But Helaena, a neurodivergent woman who obviously would not be trained or taught by Criston Cole, is comfortable enough with him that she grabs onto him when she's afraid. So he clearly plays a significant role in this family, genuinely cares for Alicent and her children, and they genuinely care for him. Yes, his relationship with Rhaenyra may have been the inciting factor for his initial connection with Alicent, but he has developed a whole life and become a crucial part of a real family as a result of that. Rhaenyra is clearly the main character of the story, but she's not the main character of everyone's story, and Criston Cole is the perfect example of that. He may have been integrated into the plot as a result of Rhaenyra making him Kingsguard and having an affair with him, but he hasn't devoted his life to vengeance against her. Clearly, he doesn't like her and doesn't want her to be queen, but to presume that he hates her more than he loves Alicent, Aegon, Aemond, and Helaena, all of whom will likely have to be killed in order to cement Rhaenyra and Jace's claim to the Iron Throne, is a dramatic misunderstanding and reduction of his character. What makes Criston Cole interesting to watch is the fact that he is someone who is entangled into this world by chance, but whose relationships that he was never even meant to have in the first place turn him into the Kingmaker. Rhaenyra's sexual interest in him was the first step that he took into this world. But the woman who saved his life and the children that he protected who he knew would die if Rhaenyra and Daemon managed to take the throne are what cemented him into this world. And watching someone who is doing whatever they can to ensure that the only people that they have in this world aren't murdered is far more compelling than watching a man who spent his entire life plotting revenge against a woman who used him and dumped him 20 years before. George R.R. Martin has said that the villain is the hero of the other side. And while that notion applies to all of the Greens in one way or another, it rings the most true with Sir Criston Cole. He actually managed to fight his way up to the Kingsguard and was apparently devoted to his own ideals. But Alicent and her children were the only people who were willing to see him for what he actually wanted to be. Many viewers already see him as a villain, but not for the right reasons. Clearly, he is a flawed character and a person with a lot of unresolved issues. But he is only a villain because he's trying to be the hero for the other side. He taught Aegon and Aemond how to take a punch and keep fighting because he knew they'd have to. He would murder a man whose accusations threaten Alicent's life to keep her safe. And he would put himself between Helaena and a dragon because these are the people who matter to him. And clearly, he matters to them too. So, Criston Cole is obviously working against the Blacks and is willing to do a great deal to keep Rhaenyra off the throne. But to presume that his character only matters in relation to Rhaenyra is a mistake, and it undercuts everything meaningful that his character has gone through. He might not like the people that he's fighting against, but he's doing what he does because he sincerely cares about the people that he's fighting for. And that is what makes his character interesting. But what do you think? Is Criston Cole a broadly misunderstood character? Leave your comments and opinions below, and if you're interested in more content like this, like and subscribe.